Long ago, in a cold northern city where winter seemed to linger at every rooftop, there lived two children who loved each other dearly. The boy was named Kay, and the girl was named Gerda. Their homes were small and poor, tucked beneath the sloping roofs, yet their windows stood so close that they could speak to one another as if they shared a single room. Between the windows, their families had placed little wooden boxes filled with rose bushes. In summer, the roses glowed red and sweet. In winter, snow covered everything in white silence, but the friendship between Kay and Gerda remained warm and bright. On winter evenings, when the wind rattled the eaves and the streets below disappeared beneath drifting snow, Kay and Gerda would sit together and read by candlelight. Sometimes they listened to stories, and sometimes they simply watched the snowflakes turning outside the glass. Gerda's grandmother would tell them that no two snowflakes were ever truly alike, and that each one carried a secret design from the sky. The children would smile and imagine distant kingdoms of ice, crystal palaces, and roads that shone beneath the moon. To them, winter was not yet cruel. It was mysterious, beautiful, and full of wonder. But far away, before Kay and Gerda were old enough to understand sorrow, a strange and terrible thing had happened. There existed a mirror made by a cruel spirit, and that mirror twisted everything good and lovely into something ugly and false. Kind faces looked foolish in it. Flowers seemed withered. Joy itself appeared ridiculous. One day, the mirror shattered high above the world, and its countless fragments flew across the earth like dust in a storm. Some lodged in human eyes, so that beauty could no longer be seen. Others slipped into human hearts, where warmth slowly hardened into coldness. One snowy afternoon, while Kay and Gerda were gazing at frost patterns and laughing together beside the window, Kay suddenly cried out and pressed his hand to his face. He said it felt as if a grain of sand, or perhaps a sharp needle, had pierced his eye. Gerda leaned close to help him, but she could see nothing there. Yet something unseen had indeed entered him. A splinter from the wicked mirror had flown into Kay's eye, and another into his heart. From that moment on, a quiet change began. The light in his gaze shifted, and the gentleness in him started to fade. It did not take long for the change to show. Kay, who had once been tender and cheerful, now laughed at things that were kind and beautiful. He mocked what he had once loved. When Gerda showed him a blooming rose, he said it was crooked and spoiled. Then he tore the flower apart and threw it down. Gerda stood speechless, her eyes filling with tears, unable to understand why her dearest friend had grown so sharp and distant. Day by day, Kay became colder in word and manner, and though he still sat beside her at times, it felt as if he were already moving somewhere far away. That winter arrived early and harsher than any the city remembered. The square filled with children and sleds, and Kay often tied his little sledge behind larger ones, just to feel the thrilling rush across the ice. One day, amid swirling snow and pale afternoon light, he noticed a magnificent sleigh entirely white. It glided almost silently through the storm. Seated within it was a tall woman, beautiful in a way that was both regal and frightening. Her garments shimmered like fresh snow beneath moonlight, and her eyes shone with a cold brightness no fire could soften. It was the Snow Queen. At first, Kay could only stare, as though he were looking into a dream made of ice. The white sleigh slowed, and the Snow Queen turned toward him with a silent command. Kay stepped closer without resistance. She wrapped him in a fur mantle white as frost and lifted him into the sleigh beside her. Then she kissed him lightly on the forehead, The cold of it reached deep into his bones. After the second kiss, his fear began to vanish. After the third, he forgot everything he had left behind. His home, the roses by the window, and even little Gerda. From that day on, Kay did not return. Some said he must have fallen into the river. Others whispered that he had been lost in the winter woods. But Gerda would not believe that he was gone forever. She remembered the last look in his face, strange though it had become, and she could not let go of him. Every morning she ran to the riverbank and called his name into the cold. Every night she pressed her cheek against the empty window and looked at the silent rose boxes below. There, in the stillness of winter, she made a promise to herself. No matter how far she must go, she would find Kay. When spring finally came and the ice broke apart upon the river, Gerda decided that waiting was no longer enough. If the river had taken Kay from her, then perhaps the river could also lead her to him. She climbed into a small boat tied near the shore, believing only that she must begin. The rope slipped loose, and the current drew her gently away. Alone upon the water, Gerda felt fear and courage rise together in her heart. Green buds trembled along the riverbanks, and above her the sky shone clear and wide. So began the first quiet stretch of her long journey. The river carried Gerda to a marvelous garden where flowers bloomed in every season, and golden light seemed to rest forever upon the leaves. There lived an old woman with a soft smile who welcomed Gerda kindly, fed her ripe fruit, and laid her down on a comfortable bed. Everything there was peaceful, sweet, and strangely soothing. Yet the garden held a quiet enchantment. The old woman did not wish to harm the child, but she wished to keep her. And so, by gentle magic, the memory of why Gerda had come began to blur, as though her sorrow were sinking beneath petals and sunlight. For many days Gerda wandered among flowers and warmth, almost as if winter had never existed. But one morning she stopped and noticed something deeply wrong. In that rich and shining garden, there were no roses. The moment she thought of roses, memory returned like a bell sounding through mist. She saw the narrow attic windows, the red blossoms between them, and Kay's face beside her. Then Gerda wept. Her tears fell to the earth, and where they touched the ground, a rose bush sprang up as if answering her grief. At once she understood. She had forgotten, and she must not forget again. Gerda left the garden and traveled onward across fields and lonely roads. Along the way, she met a clever black crow who told her that a young man had recently arrived at the palace of a wise princess, and that he might perhaps be the very boy she was seeking. Hope flared alive again. With the crow as her guide, Gerda entered the palace and passed through quiet corridors lit by soft lamps and guarded doors. But when she at last saw the sleeping young man, she knew at once that it was not Kay. The hope that had lifted her heart fell silent again, though it did not die. Though she had not found Kay, Gerda was treated with great kindness. The prince and princess listened to her story with pity and respect. They gave her warm clothing, gloves, and a small carriage so that she might continue more safely across the cold and distant lands ahead. They knew the world beyond their palace was wide, and that winter in the north could be merciless. Yet they also saw that this little girl carried something stronger than comfort or fear. She carried a faithful heart. And so Gerda set out once more, still sorrowful, yet strengthened by the mercy of strangers. But the road did not remain gentle. Passing through a dark forest, Gerda was captured by robbers and dragged into their rough and fire-lit camp. Surrounded by harsh voices, knives, and staring eyes, she clung to the last of her courage. Yet among them was a wild little robber girl, who for all her roughness was moved by Gerda's story. She understood loneliness in her own fierce way. In the end, it was this strange child who chose to help her. She set Gerda free, gave her food and furs, and sent her onward upon a strong reindeer who knew the frozen lands of the far north. The reindeer ran like the wind over endless snow. Together they crossed frozen plains, lonely settlements glowing faintly in the dark, and vast fields of ice where the air itself seemed sharp enough to break. Gerda shivered beneath her furs, but she held on and kept her eyes fixed ahead. Above them, the northern lights unfurled across the heavens in silent ribbons of green fire. It was as though the whole sky were watching her journey. The farther north they went, the more the world seemed stripped down to ice, breath, and faith alone. Still, Gerda did not turn back. At last, Gerda reached the Snow Queen's palace. Before her stood a place more beautiful and more terrible than anything she had imagined. It was built of ice, wind, and pale light, with halls so vast that sound itself seemed to freeze before it could echo. Snow swirled through the chambers like silent sentries. The floor shone like polished mirrors, and not a trace of living warmth could be felt anywhere. In the center of that frozen stillness sat Kay, alone upon a lake of hardened ice, arranging sharp pieces into patterns the Snow Queen had commanded him to solve. When Gerda saw Kay at last, she no longer felt the cold. She ran to him, threw her arms around him, and called his name with all the love she had carried across the world. At first, Kay sat motionless, as if her voice could not reach him. But Gerda wept, and her warm tears fell upon his chest. Then the miracle came. The frozen splinter in his heart began to melt. Kay trembled, and slowly the emptiness left his eyes. It was as if he were waking from a long and terrible dream. Little by little, he looked at Gerda and truly saw her again. Kay burst into tears, and as he wept, the fragment in his eye was washed away as well. He recognized Gerda, as he had once known her, and understood that she had never abandoned him. Hand in hand, the two children left the frozen palace behind them and began the long journey home. By the time they returned, the world seemed changed, and so did they. They were no longer the same children who had first sat beneath the attic windows. Yet there, beside the little rose boxes, the flowers bloomed once more, and Kay and Gerda understood that even after the longest winter, a faithful heart may still awaken the spring.